crush and destroy Hamas at all costs. This is the promise of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a promise that he has not stopped repeating in recent months. And he wasn't the only one to get involved. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has also pledged to wipe the Palestinian group off the face of the earth, and that is exactly what Israel has been doing for months. The problem is that it is taking not only Hamas, but also the entire Gaza Strip by storm. The devastation is total. The response to the 7th of October attacks has been even greater than anyone expected. So far, it is estimated that more than half of all buildings are either in ruins or so badly damaged as to be completely uninhabitable. Entire neighborhoods have been reduced to rubble, and of course the war is ongoing, so the destruction will be even greater. More than a military, the Israel Defense Forces have become a kind of demolition company that is leaving the Gaza Strip a veritable wasteland. Can you imagine the horror of this? 85% of the population of this territory, almost 2 million people, have been displaced, and most of these people will probably never be able to return to their homes. The situation is so bad that the United States, along with other countries such as France, Jordan, and Egypt, have had to airdrop humanitarian aid to try to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe. In fact, the US military is now preparing a floating dock to carry much larger quantities of supplies and aid. But I'm sure you already know all this, if only because it's basically what the mainstream media repeats over and over again about this war. Of course, this is VisualPolitik, so logically we can't stop there. We have to go one step further, and the question is, what now? VisualPolitik community, the large-scale military operation is nearing its end. With the assault on the city of Rafah, the Gaza Strip will be completely conquered. And of course, the Israeli force maintains full control of the airspace, the coastline, and the border crossings. In other words, in the Gaza Strip, Israel is the new sheriff. But wait a minute, because there is something wrong with this whole story. Despite all the fire and fury, Hamas has not disappeared. And do you know what? It probably never will. The ideas are not going away. The feeling of revenge and hatred towards the Jewish state is spreading like wildfire among many young people. And of course, if the guerrillas know anything, it is precisely how to move underground. And so, in recent weeks, attacks on Israeli soldiers are multiplying in areas that apparently had already been cleared. It's something that is beginning to remind many of nothing less than the nightmare that the United States experienced in Afghanistan and Iraq after both wars ended. What's more, unlike Uncle Sam, Israel cannot indefinitely maintain a military operation that is having a brutal cost, both in money and in mobilized soldiers. Soldiers who, logically, if they are deployed, cannot go to work. Not to mention the torrential fallout of international criticism that is beginning to rain down on the country. Without going any further, the last Eurovision Song Contest, in which the Israeli representative was persecuted and booed, is a good example of an anti-Israel sentiment that seemed to be forgotten and that is now making a comeback. So, I repeat the question, what can be done now? What can Israel do? Any ideas? Retreat, perhaps? Yes, I'm sure many of you have thought of this possibility. Roll up their kit bags and send the soldiers back to the barracks. Well, if so, I'm sorry to tell you that that's not a realistic option either. Israel cannot simply abandon the Strip and allow Hamas to regain control. That would be seen among Israelis as a humiliating and bloody defeat. So let me repeat the question again. What now? What are the possible outcomes of this war? What are the possible consequences of the destruction that Israel has carried out in this narrow and conflictive territory? The truth is that there doesn't seem to be a clear exit plan. This is not just our opinion. This is what Herzi Halevi says. And who is this guy? Well, he's not just anybody. We are talking about none other than the Chief of the Defense Staff of the Israel Defense Forces. And look how he doesn't hold back.
IDF chief said to upbraid Netanyahu for failing to lay out post-war strategy for Gaza.
So you see, no less than the head of the military is saying it loud and clear. He sees no exit plan to the war, and in his opinion, that is a tremendous mistake. Among other reasons, because without an exit plan, the war could become interminable. But you know what? It's better if he tells us himself.
As long as there is no diplomatic process to develop a governing body in the Strip other than Hamas, we will have to launch campaigns again and again elsewhere to dismantle the Hamas infrastructure.
And it's not just the military leadership saying this. President Biden's own national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, is basically saying the same thing.
If Israel's efforts are not accompanied by a political plan for the future of Gaza and the Palestinian people, the terrorists will keep coming back. We are seeing this happen in Gaza City.
But this is VisualPolitik, so of course we're not stopping there. In this video, we're going to see the 3 ways out of this war. But take note, the exit strategies that are realistic, not the mirages, impossible dreams, and science fiction stories of many analysts and politicians. So with that in mind, fire up your engines and let's go.
Stuck in a labyrinth.
It doesn't matter whether or not Israel succeeds in destroying Hamas. This war is desperately begging for a way out, other than condemning more than 2 million people to live permanently in a tent under the constant sound of bombs, because as we've already seen, that is not an option. That a way out is needed is something that even Netanyahu himself acknowledges, albeit half-heartedly.
We'll probably have to have some kind of civilian administration by Gazans who are not committed to our destruction.
And I say half-heartedly because, as you will see, he does not seem particularly committed to the idea of seeking peace. But be that as it may, and since I think we're all clear that some sort of plan is needed here, let's take a look at the options on the table one by one. Israel could try to take over the Gaza Strip. That is to say, to occupy it militarily as it did until 2005. Today, it seems like the distant past. But the truth is that for almost 40 years, Israel controlled this territory. It's a place where, as in the West Bank today, there were also Jewish settlements. In 2005, however, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon decided to withdraw it all, both soldiers and settlements, with the idea that Gaza would be de facto independent and could thus move towards an administration of its own. It was a very clear first step towards building a genuine Palestinian state. However, within 2 years, Hamas took over. And well, you all know the story. Ariel Sharon's plan shattered into 1,000 pieces. The problem with the military occupation is that it would require Israel to take responsibility for the entire Gazan population. And of course, the cost would be disproportionately high, both in money and in soldiers' lives. Because let's be honest, Hamas and the Palestinian insurgency would do everything possible to turn this operation into torture. So this military occupation thing is out of the question. However, this leads us directly to a possible evolution of this first plan. A plan which, by the way, is being advocated by a large part of the Israeli right wing. We're talking about turning Gaza into a Swiss cheese in the image and likeness of the West Bank. And keep in mind, the information we have today tells us that, in one way or another, this could be the way to go. So what exactly would this Swiss cheese solution consist of? Well, the idea would be that the war would continue until Hamas is effectively crushed. Not their ideas, of course, and not their organization, but at least their political and military power. Israel would then divide the Strip into 3 areas, separated from each other by relatively tight security cordons, controlled by its armed forces, which could use these corridors to intervene quickly whenever a mopping up or punishment operation was needed. This is not a theory, it's something that Israel is already preparing. This is the case, for example, in the Netzarim corridor. This 7-kilometer-long corridor separates Gaza City from the rest of the Strip, where Israel is already building military bases and surveillance structures. According to satellite images monitored by the Washington Post, Israel is even preparing a zone of checkpoints to pass from one side to the other. And something very similar, although not as aggressive, would occur in the south, with an additional security zone. The practical result is that each of the localities in this territory would be separated from the rest. In this way, Israel would be able to divide the Strip into small enclaves that would be much easier to control. And according to some sources, the Israeli government may even want to try to make Gaza City, where most of the Gazan population has lived until now, virtually empty, or allow only controlled, let's call them non-hostile people to live there. The idea would apparently be to move the possible rocket launching zones far away from the most populated areas of Israel. For the time being, what we know is that Israel has banned access to this city and has also turned off the tap of humanitarian aid, probably to force the 300,000 people who are still there to move. And remember, the plan is even broader. On top of what we've already told you, Israel has also demolished all the buildings located within 1 kilometer of the border. From now on, this space will be a kind of huge militarized security cordon where no Palestinian will be able to enter. A space that, as you can imagine, will be heavily guarded and protected by the armed forces. Of course, as you all know, the Gaza Strip is a small enclave, so by itself, this cordon accounts for 16% of its entire territory. Finally, once all these measures and secure spaces are in place, Israel would leave the site. state, while maintaining its military presence both in the Netzarim corridor and on the Gaza border, from where it would also actively monitor the entire area. VisualPolitik community, this is basically the plan that Israel, or at least a good part of the government, seems to be working on at the moment. Of course, it is not that easy. Why? Because it would practically establish an apartheid system in Gaza. Think about it. Gazans would not be able to move freely. All their trade would be heavily restricted. Israel would control all entries and exits, and of course, there could be no economic development. Instead of Plan Israel, we might as well call it Plan South Africa. Of course, the international community, starting with the United States, and continuing with the Arab countries, have already said that they will not allow it. So as much as this possibility may please the religious Zionists, who are the extremists forming government with Netanyahu, this does not seem a viable plan in the medium to long term. In other words, it's back to the drawing board. In the United States, they are considering a very different possibility: the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Gaza Strip, which will be automatically replaced by a multinational force composed mainly of soldiers from Arab countries. In this way, administrative control would be ceded to the Palestinian National Authority, and international troops would be in charge of ensuring security and preventing Hamas from regaining power. This is a tune that sounds pretty good to many people in Israel.
This would be in Israel's interest. The option of the Palestinian Authority taking control of Gaza is much better than having our soldiers control 2.2 million people. We are not interested in holding that territory. All we want is a peaceful situation for our people.
The plan would in turn be accompanied by a huge sum of money to finance the reconstruction. Who would put up the dough? Basically, the United States, the European Union, and above all, the Arab countries. So let's just say it would be a way for the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia to buy the normalization of their political and economic ties with Israel from their respective peoples. Sounds like a great option, doesn't it? Well, put on the brakes, because it's not that easy either. First, because the Palestinian National Authority is not popular at all, neither in Gaza nor in the West Bank. And in reality, it most likely wouldn't be any alternative administration imposed from outside that would have to confront Hamas, Islamic Jihad Palestine, and other guerrilla organizations. It would almost certainly be seen as an outsider and collaborator of Israel. And second, and perhaps even more importantly, because the Arab countries are not amused by all this. Put your soldiers in a hornet's nest and give the impression that they are collaborating with Israel's troops? No thanks. But Washington is trying nonetheless.
U.S. encouraging Arab states to join multinational post-war force in Gaza.
The problem is that the Arab countries have sensed all the inconveniences that this intervention could bring them, and guess what? They are being damned smart. They are telling the United States, okay, but as long as they lead the operation. In other words, that the US put up most or at least many of the soldiers. In practice, this is tantamount to torpedoing the operation, because of course this is non-negotiable for Washington. US soldiers in Gaza would become walking targets. The risk of returning to the worst post-war moments in Iraq would be highly likely, and this is something totally unacceptable for Uncle Sam. And that's not even all. Arab countries are also demanding that the United States recognize the Palestinian state. And if all this were not enough, Israel has already said that it does not trust such a plan. No way is it going to delegate control of Hamas to soldiers from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, or Jordan. Much less does it trust a Palestinian National Authority that still does not condemn the attacks of 7th of October. So Israel has already made it clear that in any case, it would reserve the right to intervene, which of course scares the Arab countries even more. Lest Israeli bombs end up falling on their own soldiers, that would lead to a mega crisis. And to top it all off, the problem of the Palestinian state would continue to exist. And as long as it exists, there will hardly be a real solution to the conflict. So, although we cannot rule out an option that the United States is still working on, it does not seem at all likely to go ahead. And if it does go ahead, it's not clear that it would be a real solution. And this leads us directly to make a 180-degree turn and put on the table an alternative that very few are arguing for, but that could be a real turning point. A new plan that in the long run is probably the most realistic option of all. We're talking about putting an end once and for all to the idea of the Palestinian state in order to try to put in place two different Palestinian states. Wait a minute, what's this all about? Well, we're going to take a look at that right now. Okay, this option is not completely independent of the previous two. It would also require a gradual and probably not immediate withdrawal of Israeli troops and subsequent support and money from an international partnership. Even so, it would have an important difference. Instead of giving power to the Palestinian National Authority, the idea would be to launch a new local administration with Gazans at the helm, and with the possibility of soon becoming a full, sovereign, and independent state. VisualPolitik community, it may surprise you, but the Palestinian statehood story is becoming a big trap. Palestine can hardly ever be a cohesive, independent state. Why do I say this? Well, because their territories are tremendously different. Look at this. Gaza is an urban territory. The West Bank, on the other hand, is much more rural and much less urbanized. Gaza is a compact territory. The West Bank is not. Gaza is a coastal territory with ports, while the West Bank is landlocked. Gaza is connected to Egypt, the West Bank to Jordan. Gaza is very poor. The West Bank, on the other hand, has an average income. In practice, everything is different, and that means the needs, the problems, and the policies required are very different. What's more, the two territories are not contiguous, and they will never have easy communication with each other. Israel will always be in the way, and if historical evidence tells us anything, it's that this rarely works. Among other reasons, because political leaders are a product of their environments. So I can already tell you that the political leaders in Gaza and the West Bank are going to be more and more different as time goes by. Therefore, to insist on the two-state solution, Israel and Palestine, is to bet on a failed solution from the outset. Evolving to a three-state solution could be much better. The territories would have their own dynamics, could develop their own policies, could have administrations much more in touch with the people, and could better control the territory. And don't forget that a Palestinian state as such has never existed, so there's not really anything to lose. Of course, the problem of Hamas and other radical groups would still exist, but starting to build an independent state once and for all, with the support of the rest of the Arab countries, could make the Gazan society inclined to look to the future instead of continuing to rely on these terrorist and radical groups. It would be something like giving them a real outlet. And if it doesn't work, it could at least make it possible to solve the other half of the problem, that of the West Bank, a territory that in recent years has been much more connected to Israel. Now the question is, could Gaza really develop? Well, in order to wrap up this video, that is exactly what we are going to look at.
Gaza 2.0.
When Israel withdrew completely from the Gaza Strip in 2005, the expectation was that the territory could prosper by exporting products to Egypt and also to Israel. However, when Hamas took control in 2007, all these plans went out of the window. The Palestinians, instead of taking advantage of the productive resources left behind by the Israelis, destroyed them because they were Jewish installations. And not only that, the Hamas takeover, with its extremist and violent discourse, caused both Israel and Egypt to establish a trade blockade that has strangled the Gazan economy. On top of all that, this territory has an additional problem. Too many people in too little space. The Strip is almost as densely populated as the city of London, but has the amenities of a small town in Iowa. This makes Gaza dependent on the outside, even for food. There is simply not enough land available to feed so many people. What's more, the problem is growing, because the population here is very young and growing all the time. Well, all these factors explain why, even before this latest clash with Israel, Gaza was already a tremendously poor place that basically survived thanks to international charity. However, it is not all bad news. Gaza also has some advantages. For example, it's a coastal land located in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. This means that if things were normalized, this place would have much more facilities than, for example, the West Bank to trade with the rest of the world. Plus, Gaza also has many beaches. This could facilitate the arrival of tourists, especially from other Arab countries, such as Egypt or Jordan. Gaza could even become a kind of tax haven for Muslims from all over the world. After all, right now, its tax system is virtually non-existent, so the new authorities could use this as a starting point to set up a very competitive tax policy that would be able to attract a lot of money, particularly from the more than 6 million people who make up the Palestinian diaspora worldwide. This is in fact unaccounted for, but remittances are by far the main economic activity in Palestine. They account for almost 1/5 of its entire economy, and even more so in Gaza. So if things were to normalize, the influx of money could be very important. And an even more crucial factor is Gaza's location next to Egypt, a Muslim country with almost 120 million inhabitants, would also be of enormous help. Not only could Gaza attract many Egyptians as an exotic, low-cost tourist destination, but they could also sell them many services. But okay, I know that all this may seem like a real science fiction novel right now, and that many of you may think I've gone out of my mind. But if things stabilize, all these new businesses could start sprouting up relatively quickly. The problem is that in order for this to happen, Hamas and the other radical groups have to disappear. That would open the way for Gazans to create their own state. Money for reconstruction, dreams, and a professional future could begin to end the reign of Hamas. It's a possibility. Its success is not certain, but it's probably the best alternative of all. But having said that, now the question for us to start the debate is a very clear one. How would you resolve this conflict? We'll open a debate in the comments, and we'd be happy to read your opinions. Now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. Thank you very much once again for being there. All the best, and see you soon.